Welcome. I am delighted to welcome you today to what I very much hope will be our last regular Zoom lecture in the Remapping Abrahamic Religions series. We will have one more Zoom event for those who are coming in from far away on October 11th on Islam, Christianity, and Judaism in Black communities globally. So definitely check on the site in the fall. In the meantime, I'm so pleased to welcome two experts in the exciting topic for today. Our speaker, Dr. Shatha Almutawa, who earned her PhD at the University of Chicago Divinity School. She currently serves as an assistant professor in philosophy and religion at the American University in Washington, D.C. Her specialty is Islamic intellectual history, and much of her research has, like today's lecture, touched on intellectual exchange between Islam and other religions, particularly the relations between Islam and Judaism. She has numerous publications and awards to her credit, including the highly competitive individual research grant from the American Academy of Religion. Our respondent and facilitator today, Dr. Dalia Yasharpour, earned her PhD at the University of California in Los Angeles, and she currently teaches courses at UCLA and other universities in Southern California. Dr. Yasharpour joins us today, however, in her role as an expert on the reception history of the Buddha narratives in Jewish, Judeo-Persian, and Islamic Persian sources. Her book on the topic is titled The Prince and the Sufi, the Judeo-Persian rendition of the Buddha biographies. Should you wish to read more on this topic after today's session, as I'm sure most of us will. So with that, let us begin our lecture.
Thank you, Professor Wallenberg and Professor Speech, for inviting me to give this lecture. Thank you, Dr. Yasharpour, for serving as respondent today. And thank you to Ms. Keeves for organizing this event. Thank you to everyone in the audience for being here. I'm excited to share with you my research about cosmopolitan and connected communities, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian, in the medieval period. I will focus on one of these communities, a 10th century Muslim secret society in Iraq that called itself Ikhwan al-Safa, which translates to the Brethren of Purity or the Sincere Brothers. This Shi'i brotherhood reimagined Islamic concepts, beliefs, and practices. They saw themselves as da'is or missionaries, but they redefined da'wah or missionary activity. I argue that their da'wah or call to God had the purpose of spreading Greek Neoplatonic asceticism. When they instructed their missionaries, they used a Buddhist narrative, and not just any Buddhist narrative. The narrative they used is the story of the Buddha's life, with elements from the Jataka tales and the Buddha Charita. This Neoplatonic secret society produced 52 encyclopedic philosophical epistles, covering a wide range of topics from arithmetic, astronomy, and geography to love and magic. In their 48th epistle, they teach their brothers the nuts and bolts of da'wah. To illustrate their points about missionary activity, they told the story of the Buddha's life, showing their readers how to choose the people to approach and how to approach them. This story was told by other Muslims, Christians, and Jews as well throughout the medieval period. And in this table, you can see that there are many different versions that were produced by Muslims in Arabic. They also produced versions in Persian. Christian versions were written in Georgian, Greek, Latin, and then later on also Christian Arabic translations were produced. And Jewish versions include Ibn Khazdai's Hebrew version and Raghib's Judeo-Persian version, which is translated so beautifully by Dr. Yasharpour. The choices that Ikhwan al-Safa made in this epistle tell us a great deal about how they approached religion, especially their own. Their reinterpretation of da'wah, the reconceptualization of the call to God, and their use of a religious practice to spread Greek philosophy all show that Islam in their time was fluid and malleable. Furthermore, the popularity of this narrative, not only in Muslim communities, but also in Christian and Jewish ones, shows how comfortable people of different religions in the medieval period were in telling the stories of other religious traditions and using them for their own purposes. The subject of this lecture, the cosmopolitanism and exchange of different Muslim, Christian, and Jewish societies in the medieval period, is a perfect example of the assertion that Dalal Asad made in his famous essay, The Idea of an Anthropology of Islam. He writes, quote, "Traditions should not be regarded as essentially homogeneous, that heterogeneity in traditional practices is not necessarily an indication of the absence of an Islamic tradition. The variety of traditional Islamic practices in different times, places, and populations indicates the different Islamic reasonings that different social and historical conditions can or cannot sustain." The idea that traditions are essentially homogeneous has a powerful intellectual appeal, but it is mistaken, end quote. So now I turn to this phenomenon of the telling of the story of the Buddha by Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities that demonstrates Asad's point. 1,000 years ago, Ikhwan al-Safa told a story about a king who became a new father. This king consulted his astrologers and learned from them that his son would inherit a heavenly kingdom instead of his earthly kingdom. This distressed him. He was determined to prevent his son from renouncing his royalty and giving up all worldly desires. He secluded his son in the palace, keeping him away from the miseries of life and sheltering him from anything that might spur his interest in religion or asceticism. The young prince, however, was intelligent and asked many questions. He wanted to know what was beyond his experience and the life he knew. News about his questions and intelligence spread, and a wise man in Sri Lanka heard about him. He traveled to the palace and told a servant that he had magnificent gems that only the prince can see. The servant took the wise man to the prince, and the wise man told the prince why he was really there. The prince then asked the wise man his questions, and in response, the wise man told him 2 parables. Those who are familiar with Buddhism would immediately recognize the story as the story of the Buddha's life, at least its beginning. But this particular text was not written by Buddhists. It was not in Sanskrit or Pali, the languages of written Buddhist texts. It was written by Muslims in the Iraqi cities of Basra and Baghdad, in Arabic. The authors told the story without using any names, and they did not introduce it as the story of the Buddha. In their retelling of the story, they stripped it of its religious Buddhist elements and replaced these with Greek Neoplatonic philosophy. The story was also Islamized. Instead of any mention of the ending of suffering or meditation, we have instead mention of the one God and prophets of Islam. The name Bilawhar appears in Epistle 48. Bilawhar is the Arabic name used for the Buddha in the Arabic narratives about the Buddha's life. In fact, Bilawhar is quoted alongside the prophets Muhammad, Moses, and Jesus in the same epistle, showing that they revere him and give him equal standing as the prophets of God. It is also important to note that they give this status to the Greek philosophers as well. Ikhwan al-Safa see philosophy and religion as equally valid paths to knowing God and achieving salvation. They seem to have believed that any religious path is valid as long as it was paired with contemplation, education, and a commitment to happiness in the life to come. Although they gave Bilawhar a respected position in Epistle 48 by quoting him when they quoted the prophets, Ikhwan al-Safa did not use the narrative to talk about Buddhism or the Buddha. As I mentioned earlier, they used the narrative about the Buddha's life in their epistle on Dawah, or the call to God. This narrative is dedicated to instructing the brothers in how to identify appropriate candidates who might be receptive to their Neoplatonic message, and teaches them how to approach those who are in high positions in society, such as kings and princes. In fact, Ikhwan al-Safa break off the telling of the story of the Buddha in order to interject that the prince in the narrative is an excellent example of a good person to approach. He is young, intelligent, and already curious about the world. Thus, the story that Ikhwan al-Safa tell is not the story of the enlightened Buddha. Their narrative ends after the wise man tells the prince two parables, and the reader does not see what the prince does with the parables he hears. The figure that we encounter in Ikhwan al-Safa's narrative is a person who needs to be instructed about truth, whereas the Buddhist narratives about the Buddha's life do not end there. In the Buddhist narratives, the prince ultimately becomes the enlightened Buddha. Are Ikhwan al-Safa then presenting the prince from the Buddhist narratives as someone in need of conversion? Yes and no. Their missionary activity is not a project of converting non-Muslims to Islam. Instead, it is to convert Muslims to Neoplatonic asceticism. The young prince in the Buddhist narratives does reach the truth, and Ikhwan al-Safa accept the different descriptions of truth that different traditions offer. The content of their da'wah is not to spread the Arabic words of God and his messenger that appear in the Quran and Hadith to those who have not heard them before. Rather, they offer a reinterpretation of Quran and Hadith to those who already know them. They want their readers to see that truth is in both scripture and in the words of Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus. They want their readers to transcend the literal meaning of the text and to dive into the abstract philosophical ideas that they see behind the words. In their Rasa'il, Ikhwan al-Safa rely on Greek sources as much as they rely on the Quran and Hadith. They use the Greek works to make sense of the concepts that appear in the Quran, such as heaven and hell. For them, heaven is the release of the soul from the chains of the body, and hell is the soul's attachment to the material world. Ikhwan al-Safa rely on the Theology of Aristotle, a work that was not actually written by Aristotle, to understand the soul and its relationship to the world and to God. This work is an adaptation of parts of the Aeneads of Plotinus, and it is one of the most important works for Muslim philosophers throughout the medieval period. Neoplatonism, and in particular the ideas from Plotinus's Aeneads, as they were known to the Arabs through the Theology of Aristotle, is central to Epistle 48. Ikhwan al-Safa make it abundantly clear that their da'wah is for the sake of the release of the body so that it can return to its source. As you can see from this slide, Ikhwan al-Safa use Epistle 48 to talk about da'wah, but the content of the da'wah is really related to the descent of the soul into the body, and here they think of that in absolutely Neoplatonic terms, following the language and the descriptions of the Aeneads as they appear in the Theology of Aristotle. And they think about the final aim of human life as the soul's release from the material world. Again, very Neoplatonic material here. So this is put side by side with the material about reaching kings, princes, and people in high offices for their missionary activity. If we look at the structure of the narrative as it is told by Ikhwan al-Safa, we see that they really only retained the beginning of the story of the Buddha. They took from it the birth of the prince, the father's consulting of the astrologers, and his decision to shelter the prince from the miseries of the world in order to prevent him from taking the path of asceticism. The rest is not part of the Buddha Charita, the Jataka tales, or other Buddhist texts. Perhaps Ikhwan al-Safa cut off the narrative of the Buddha's life intentionally as part of their educational method. Ikhwan al-Safa's pedagogical philosophy stipulates that only students who are ready are exposed to difficult concepts. They set up their curriculum strategically, with each epistle serving as a building block for the next. Since their ultimate goal is for the reader to be convinced to renounce the material world, they build up to this idea slowly. Renunciation becomes the theme of one of the last epistles they tell, or rather a narrative in one of the last epistles they tell. In this last epistle, we encounter a king who, upon learning about the spiritual kingdom, takes action on that knowledge by renouncing his kingdom and the material world. In a way, this last narrative finishes the story that was started a few epistles earlier. Although we don't see the young prince renounce his kingdom in Epistle 48, we do see a king and his vizier renounce theirs in Epistle 52. While Ikhwan al-Safa's version of the narrative contains very little material from the original Sanskrit and Pali narratives about the Buddha, other early Muslim adaptations of the narrative do include more. The longest surviving version, known as Kitab Bilawhar wa Buddha Saf, retains a great deal more of the story of the Buddha. For example, the name Buddha Saf is from the Sanskrit Bodhisattva. Kitab Bilawhar wa Buddha Saf includes details about the queen's dream of a white elephant, which foretold the birth of the prince. This longer version also shows the prince going out of the palace and seeing a sick man and a blind man, which prompts him to ask questions and learn about illness and old age. On another outing, he learns about death. Still, even though the longer version includes more of the recognizable elements of the Buddhist story of the Buddha, this Arabic version also strips the story of its religious elements, replacing them with Abrahamic monotheism. Different Arabic versions include different parables that the wise man tells the prince, with some overlap between these parables. Jewish and Christian communities, too, found the story compelling, and they also adapted it, as I mentioned earlier, introducing into the narrative Jewish and Christian elements where Buddhist elements would be. Christian versions were written in Georgian, Greek, and Latin, as you saw in that table. Jewish versions were written in Hebrew and Judeo-Persian, again, as you saw in the table, but there are also the Manichaean versions, and those include a Turkic Manichaean fragment, which I will mention later, and that is especially interesting. There are so many versions of these narratives that scholars have had a hard time determining which came first. This diagram that you see on the screen has shifted a little bit over the centuries that this text has been studied. This diagram, prepared by Dubois and published in the Encyclopedia of Islam, shows the relationship between these different versions as posited by scholars. But they raise one question: how did narratives about the Buddha's life travel from India to Iraq, to Georgia, to Constantinople, and Spain. There are multiple theories, and I will offer 4. So we have the exchange on the Silk Road as a possibility for exchange between people of different religions with Buddhists, Islamic conquests of India, Afghanistan, and Persia, the Barmaki family's court positions in Iraq, and the Turkic Manichaean intermediaries, and also Persian Manichaean intermediaries. The first possibility for exchange is the Silk Road trade routes. Exchange between people in the Arabian Peninsula and people in India existed from the pre-Islamic period. The Arabian Peninsula was home to polytheistic Christian and Jewish tribes for many centuries. Arabs from the peninsula engaged in trade with people in India, traveling there and in some cases settling in India. The trade routes were many and connected India to other parts of the world as well. It is conceivable that trade on the Silk Road resulted in cultural exchange and exposure to Buddhist ideas and traditions. In fact, Imtiaz Yusuf writes that this exchange was also prevalent in Iraq. He cites the historian at-Tabari, who wrote about Buddhist statues that were brought from the city of Kabul in Afghanistan to Baghdad in Iraq. Yusuf argues that Buddhists were considered people of the book in the early centuries of Islam. The second opportunity for exchange occurred with the expansion of Islam into Persia and what we today call Afghanistan and Pakistan. Communities in these regions practiced different religions, including Manichaeanism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. When Muslims conquered areas where Buddhist communities lived, their encounter with these communities made possible their learning about the different traditions they practiced, and it is likely that they learned about narratives about the Buddha's life as a consequence of the resulting exchange. We see this kind of exchange happening in other parts of the world that Muslims conquered and settled in. For example, Muslim expansion into the Byzantine Empire resulted in the translation of the majority of Greek works into Arabic in a massive multi-generational translation movement. This translation movement occurred during the Abbasid period, giving rise to Muslim Aristotelian and Neoplatonic philosophy. As a result of the conquest of Byzantium and the translation movement, Muslims were exposed to Greek worldviews, myths, poetry, sciences, medicine, and philosophy, and absorbed a great deal of it into Arabic thought and culture. This was also the case when Muslims expanded into Persia. Persian culture and literature came to rival Arabic culture and literature during the Abbasid period. For this reason, it's not inconceivable that with the Muslim expansion into Persia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, Muslims would engage in cultural exchange with cultures there and would be exposed to their religious traditions. The third possibility is Arab-Muslim travel and exploration sponsored by the powerful Barmaki family, a family of Abbasi courtiers. The Barmakids were an important Buddhist family in the city of Balkh, where they had important roles in Buddhist life. In the second half of the 8th century, members of this family were invited to serve in the court of the Caliph in Baghdad. The first Barmaki to serve in the Abbasi court was Khalid ibn Barmak, who died in 781 or 782. Over time, the Barmakids converted to Islam. They sponsored the translation of Sanskrit texts into Arabic, and these included medical texts and mirrors for princes. It is because of them that works like the Panchatantra or the Kalila wa Dimna were translated into Arabic. The Barmakids also commissioned writers to travel to India and write about it. Towards the end of the 8th century, the Barmaki vizier sent Yahya ibn Khalid to India, where he wrote about his travels at the request of the Barmakids. In this account, he includes a description of Buddhism. His original account has been lost, but a copy made by Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi survives in Ibn Nadim's Kitab al-Fihrast. In his description of Buddhism, Yahya ibn Khalid uses the term Buddhasaf without explanation. The scholar Johann Elverskog writes that in the medieval period, the name Buddhasaf was as much a part of the Muslim lexicon as some Sanskrit terms are part of everyday life now in English, or in part of everyday English. The fourth and final possibility for Arab exposure to Buddhism is through an intermediary, specifically the Manichaeans. Fragments of Manichaean works containing parts of the story of the Buddha's life or some of the parables that appear in the Arabic versions were found in Turfan, a city in China that had a significant Turkic Manichaean community. One surviving Turkic Manichaean fragment suggests that a Turkic Manichaean intermediary might have been the source for some of the Arabic adaptations of the stories of the Buddha's life. This fragment contains the story of the prince and the corpse. In this story, a prince gets bored by the very long wedding celebrations in his very own wedding, and he decides to go for a walk in the middle of the night. He gets a little lost on the way back, and instead of re-entering the palace, he enters a sarcophagus. He assumes that all the wedding guests had fallen asleep, and he tries to find his bride by touching the fabric that the people are wearing. When he finds the body with the softest fabric, he assumes that this is his bride. He consummates his marriage. And in the morning, he realizes that instead of his bride, he had slept with a corpse. If this parable was originally a Manichaean parable, then Ikhwan al-Safa's version of the Buddha's life did not only combine Buddhist, Muslim, and Greek elements in this one narrative, but also a Manichaean element. But who are the Turkic Manichaeans, and what is their relationship to Buddhism? Hans J. Klimkite describes Turkic religion before Islam as, quote, marked by a cult of heaven and earth and the veneration of ancestors. The earliest known contact, so the veneration of ancestors, end quote. The earliest known contact between Turkic people and Chinese Buddhists occurred in the 6th century, and along with it, conversion of Turkic people to Buddhism. Buddhist temples were erected for Turkic Buddhists in Chang'an in north-central China in the 6th century. Around 6,000 Turkic Buddhists lived there. It was also in that century when a Buddhist text, the Nirvana Sutra, was translated into Turkic, possibly using Sogdian script. Buddhist monks also stayed in cities in the Turkic kingdom Turkut during their travels, potentially teaching the Dharma while they were there. Later, Central Asia was ruled by the Chinese for 30 years. A Turkic Manichaean text was potentially the source of the parable of the prince and the corpse that appears in Ikhwan al-Safa's narrative. As for the rest of the Bilawhar wa Buddhasaf narrative, scholars believe that the story of the Buddha's life came to the Arabs through a Persian Manichaean intermediary. This is plausible, although, like other theories and possibilities, it has come under scrutiny. Regardless of which path the narrative took to get to the Arabs, once the Arabic versions appeared, Christian and Jewish versions became possible. At some point after the Georgian, Greek, and Latin versions were produced, Christians took the two main figures of the Bilawhar wa Budasaf narrative to be Christian saints. Bilawhar became Barlam and Budasaf became Josaphat, with their own feast days in different Christian traditions. They became Christian saints. In the Greek version, many Buddhist elements are replaced with language about the Spirit and Son of God, the Holy Ghost, the Apostles, the Church of Christ, the cross, and sin. Direct quotations from the Bible pepper the text. The story is explicitly about Christians. Barlam is a priest and the ascetics are Christian monks. But when the prince Yosef sees a blind man and a maimed man and asks questions about them, he is told that this is human suffering. At the end of this narrative, the king converts to Christianity and shortly thereafter dies. At this point, the prince asks the people to find themselves a new leader so he could dedicate himself to God. The story of Yosef ends with his death, quote, having crucified the world to himself and himself unto the world. The book Barlam and Yosef was attributed to Saint John of Damascus, an important theologian whose father worked in the Muslim court in Damascus. John took over his father's position in the court after his father died, but later renounced it to become a monk in Marsaba, a monastery near Jerusalem. Christians traveled from different cities to seek his counsel. According to David Lang, the earlier copies of the Greek ascribed the text to John the monk, and later copyists replaced John the monk with John of Damascus. The Jewish versions are also very interesting. Ibn Khazdai, writing in 13th century Spain, translated the narrative into Hebrew using verse. He, like Ikhwan al-Safa, introduced Neoplatonic philosophy into the narrative, this time citing directly from the Theology of Aristotle, the source that also influenced Ikhwan al-Safa and most later Muslim philosophers. Muslim and Jewish philosophers took from it the idea of emanation, which became the bedrock of their philosophical worldview, and also used it to understand the soul and its yearning to return to the spiritual realm. A few centuries later, a man who called himself Raghib translated Ibn Khazdai's The Prince and the Ascetic into Judeo-Persian, struggling with the verse, but producing a magnificently beautiful work that, as I mentioned earlier, was translated into English by Dr. Dalia Yasharpour, and we're so fortunate to have her with us here today. Raghib's version opens with a preface stating, quote, "Know that this book, The Prince and the Ascetic, was first in Greek and secondly translated into the Arabic language." If you look at the diagram showing the transmission of the narrative, you'll see that scholars think that the Arabic, this one, came before the Greek. Here. Is the Arabic that Raghib refers to the long recension that is published by Jimare as Kitab Bilawhar wa Budasaf, or a different Arabic version? And that's the version that was published by Jimare, and then we have all these other Arabic versions. If he is referring to the long recension, which is this one, then it comes directly from a lost Arabic translation that is based on a Manichaean Pahlavi translation, not from the Greek tradition and translation. But something else in Raghib's opening would give us a clue that the Arabic version that he might be thinking about is potentially this one. Raghib's version is set in Abyssinia, not in India. Jimare writes that, quote, Most of the Greek manuscripts describe the tale rather enigmatically as an edifying story from the inner land of the Ethiopians, called the land of the Indians. What does this tell us about the Arabic version that Ibn Khasdai read, on which Raghib based his version? Perhaps Ibn Khasdai's version was an Arabic translated from a Christian Greek version, not the Arabic Kitab Bilawhar wa Budasaf, published by Jimare and translated from the Pahlavi. The diagram from the second edition of the Encyclopedia of Islam shows the existence of a Christian Arabic translation from the Greek and has the Hebrew here. So this is still up to debate. By the 13th century, the story of the Buddha's life had been translated into Armenian, Old Turkish, and Georgian. David Lang wrote in his introduction to the translation of Barlam and Yosef, quote, "While this book was already in the press, news was received from Soviet Georgia of the recovery of yet another manuscript version of the Georgian Balavariani, this time in verse. The new text was found quite by chance in the Rashta district, hidden in the trunk of a venerable yew tree. The manuscript is relatively modern, dating from the 8th century. From the 18th century. The discovery is valuable as further evidence of the vitality and wide appeal of this truly remarkable story." End quote. All of the thinkers who read, translated, and adapted narratives about the Buddha integrated these narratives into their own traditions, using them as vehicles for their own philosophies, religious ideas, and even political goals. The existence of these narratives in so many cities, in so many languages and traditions is evidence that the cultures that we think of as Muslim, Christian, and Jewish were not isolated in the medieval period. They were not homogeneous or insular. They interacted with each other and with other cultures, transforming themselves and the traditions of others, reimagining what it means to be religious, and rethinking the relationship between philosophy and religion. Thank you. Dalia, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I was thanking you. Thank you for an amazing talk. Dr. Shatha Almutawa, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought you did such an amazing job of bringing a tremendous amount of information to us in a way that we could easily digest. How you were able to show us the connection between a wide variety of sources, all sharing this common narrative, and with such gorgeous visuals and diagrams that brought everything together and made it easier to get such a wide panoramic view of your topic. That's not easy to do. And you did it with just an amazing grasp at all that's involved in your work. And I'm really fascinated. I wonder, are you producing a book about this research? And can you share that with us?
Thank you very much for these very kind words and for the wonderful question. Yes, I am currently working on a book about the narratives that appear in Rasa'il Ikhwan al-Safa. The book looks at the different types of narratives that are used. There are about 43 of them in the Rasa'il, in the 52 epistles. Many of them are allegorical, very philosophical, very clearly related to the Neoplatonic agenda that they have. Some of these narratives come from Jewish texts, from the Bible, from rabbinic sources, from Greek works, and Indian sources as well. For example, they tell the story of Gyges from Plato's Republic, Book 2, which is very interesting because Plato's dialogues were, for the most part, not translated into Arabic, even though so many Greek works were. So I look at the transmission of these different narratives, how they came to Iraq in the 10th century, and then how Ikhwan al-Safa transformed these narratives and used them for their own purposes.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that the narratives are concentrated in certain epistles, or are they all throughout?
That's a good question. There are some epistles that don't have narratives, and there are some that have more narratives. We also have the very famous animal fable, which appears in Epistle 22, and that is the majority of the epistle. But then in the earlier narratives, we have much shorter stories. And some of these stories are basically mathematical word problems. So they tell us about, for example, one man who's buying land from another man, and they have a dispute about the size of the land and the price. And they basically walk you through how to do the math in that situation. The purpose of telling these earlier stories is to establish the necessity of studying the sciences, all of the sciences, and beginning with arithmetic and geometry, and then moving on to the theological sciences, and in the end, magic. The epistle on magic at the end is fascinating for so many different reasons. It survives in very different manuscript traditions, and some of these manuscripts don't contain the same narratives. So we also have narratives that might have been added by editors or taken out by editors, which is really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And so do you find that part of what you're doing right now is sort of formulating how you'd like to categorize or approach the narratives, how to maybe put them into certain groups and then treat them accordingly?
Yes, that has been part of the project, although the categories keep shifting and changing. This is a text that has so many layers of meaning, so many different layers of meaning. And also it is an Ismaili text, and there is all of this Ismaili, there are so many possible ways of reading it that include Ismaili readings. Mm-hmm. So you have on the one hand, the Neoplatonic message, you have the Ismaili identity that the authors are coming with, and then you have whatever they're telling us, this is a story about X. But very often they'll give us a story about X, and then they will say, and you can read it allegorically in this way. And then the context gives you a lot of questions too, because they're using a story in a place where it doesn't seem to make sense. For example, going back to the example of the story of Gyges from Plato's Republic, we have the story of a shepherd who finds a ring, and the ring makes him invisible. So he uses the ring to enter the king's palace, kill the king, and take his place. In Plato's Republic, this is a story about justice. Ikhwan al-Safa use it in the epistle on magic. And they say, here's an example of all of these important texts that tell us that magic exists. Of course, Plato is not trying to use this narrative to tell us that Plato exists. So this gives me pause to ask, why are they making these claims, and why are they using these narratives in these particular places?
In my experience with the Jewish and and I should rephrase that, and I hope we can get to this idea of how we want to identify these different renditions. Should we call them Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, or as the diagram that you showed, the Encyclopedia of Islam diagram shows, where it goes by language. My tendency would be to stick to the language, because from rendition to rendition, whether there's religion involved varies to a lot, quite a bit. And so I would say when we talk about these different renditions, I try to stay away from translation, because they do take so much liberty, right? As you said, with this particular story that they put in their epistle on magic, they use it in whatever way they want to support their message. And they're not at all apologetic about it. It's a story, it serves their narrative, and they use it as they see fit. And that's something I see happening in the Hebrew account, the Hebrew rendition. I see it happening with the Judeo-Persian, where, you know, the author takes material and says, okay, how do I want to reach my readership? Who is my readership, and what is my goal? With the Hebrew, his goal is fascinating that it's similar to the Ikhwan al-Safa. It's Neoplatonic. And he takes from that and he draws narratives and puts it in a way that he feels is going to serve his Neoplatonic message. And then with the Judeo-Persian is looking at a highly acculturated Persian Jewish audience that has a fascination with Sufism. And so he takes the parables and uses them for his message of popular Sufism and to give pragmatic knowledge. And so I'm seeing a lot of parallels between what you're saying, how the Ikhwan al-Safa use narrative to serve their purpose, without keeping true to the context in which it came. I see that happening with other renditions. It's knowledge. How are you going to use that knowledge? How are you going to convey knowledge? You'll convey it in the way that best reaches your audience, your group that you're trying to reach. And so that's something they seem to have in common.
I agree, absolutely. It's interesting that you're pointing out the religious elements and whether or not we can call or should call these Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, or stick with the language that they're using. There is so much variance in these different versions in terms of how much religion is or isn't in the text. So for example, when we're looking at Kitab Bilawhar wa Budasaf, it seems so much less focused on religion than when we're looking at the Greek rendition. And when we look at the Greek, it's a Christian text about Christianity. The through line is the conversion of the king to Christianity and the journey that the prince has with his religion. But that's different for Ikhwan al-Safa, who, yes, they quote the Quran here and there, but for the most part, they are not really telling a story about Islam. They're not really making it a story about Islam. On the other hand, the context is the epistle on the call to God, and the language of da'wah is infused throughout. So the context, in a sense, makes it Islamic, but they're reinterpreting da'wah too. So if they turn da'wah into the call to the Neoplatonic God of Plotinus, is that still Islam? I mean, there are so many Muslim thinkers who attacked them for these reasons and rejected their belonging to the Muslim community as a result.
Right, fascinating. I think your task is difficult in trying to this encyclopedic work that you are trying to put your arms around. It is more complicated for you in Ikhwan al-Safa, where, as you so beautifully put it, how there's these religious elements, and then there are these intellectual interests, philosophical, and so it's not black and white. It's this bringing together. And what's the common thread? I think maybe the common thread is that their interest is an intellectual one. They are truly after what they perceive to be the truth, to be knowledge, as they're conveying it to people that they want to instruct. And so they're okay with not being black and white. It's not black and white for them. And that's why they're drawn to narratives, I think, that originate, such different eclectic sources of narratives, because they are bringing it in. Whatever they feel is going to help them to convey that knowledge is game. It's fair game. They'll use it, they'll draw on it. And for an encyclopedic work of this type, it makes sense. And we see that happening with the Hebrew and the Judeo-Persian as well, where it seems like the intellectual drive to obtain truth and to convey knowledge supersedes the religious considerations. It surpasses boundaries, geographic boundaries, and intellectual boundaries and religious boundaries. And I found it fascinating that you said that that they, at times, the Brothers of Purity, they bring abstract philosophical ideas and they equate them. Is it fair to say equate them to some degree to scripture? Because I see that happening in the Judeo-Persian, where they wanted to equate Islamic mysticism with Torah, with the Jewish Bible. This kind of bringing together of divergent sources of knowledge and sharing it and saying, hey, there is commonality. It's fascinating that it exists in Ikhwan al-Safa.
Yeah, and in some cases, it's really very surprising when they do make these connections between religious ideas and then philosophical ones. And they work really hard to show the reader what the connection is. They fight the resistance, they work on it in these different epistles, piece by piece, until finally you have to accept, okay, maybe it's because of the repetition, maybe because of the hundreds of approaches that they're trying here and there, but eventually it starts to make sense. These different universes that they're bringing together start to look very, very, very similar. Yeah, one of my favorite, go ahead.
Please go ahead.
One of my favorite narratives in the Rasa'il is this dialogue between a man in heaven and a man in hell. And the man in heaven asks the man in hell, "How are you?" And the man in hell says, "I'm doing well. I'm surrounded by God's blessings." And he's just, just exuberantly joyful about the blessing that he's living in. And eventually you realize that the man in hell doesn't know that he is in hell. And the man in heaven knows that the other man is in hell. And he asks him, "What did you do in your life that you ended up there?" And the man in hell says, "I tried to convert people to God's religion. And when they didn't agree, I used force and I went to war against them. And if I captured them and they still didn't convert, I would kill them." And the man in hell tells him, "I understand now why you are where you are." And the story ends, but this really comes in the middle of a whole discussion about heaven and hell, where they're telling us why the scripture describes these gardens and the fire of hell. But in their perspective, hell is being in this physical world, and heaven is for the soul to be outside of this material existence. So again, they're taking these Quranic ideas with very, very clear descriptions of the garden and the fire and turning them into this Neoplatonic vision of the life on this earth and the life in the realm of ideas.
Fascinating. We had a question from one of our participants that asks about, given the pervasive cross-pollination between Jewish, Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, and Neoplatonic spiritual traditions, what do you believe is the importance of this knowledge in the 21st century, which seems to be an age so heavily defined by different forms of religious fundamentalism and primordialist enmity between faiths? How can we disseminate this history to the wider public?
This is a wonderful question. I am definitely drawn to Ikhwan al-Safa because of the freedom that they offer us in terms of having a relationship to the sacred text and a relationship to religion that is completely embracing of science, of intellectual inquiry, research, and exchange with people of different traditions and cultures. At the same time, they were a secret society for a reason. They kept their identity secret and they were anonymous because their ideas were not welcome by everybody. And it seems that, in their time too, there were thinkers who, like in our time, really reject and refuse the idea that everybody has access to the truth, that there are multiple paths and methods of understanding the world that are equally valid. So when I read a text like this, I tend to romanticize the 10th century and think of the medieval period as, a time of great exchange and flourishing and wonderful cross-pollination. But really, they had wars and they had problems and they had extremists and they had many people who wrote texts that were the opposite of all this. And those were, in many cases, more powerful voices than the voices of figures like Ikhwan al-Safa. Still, even though they were thought of as heretics, even though they were attacked and their belonging to the Muslim community was questioned by some people, they were extremely popular. Their work was read all over. It very quickly traveled from Iraq all the way to Spain. It influenced thought in so many communities, and it seems like that was alarming to a lot of people who didn't agree with their approach. So I think in their time, as in our time, there are those communities that want this kind of exchange and want the possibility that we all have access to truth, regardless of which tradition we come from, and that our traditions can enrich each other. And then there are those who don't see it that way.
Beautifully put. I think there's one other question, and I think that you might have partially answered it. You mentioned early in your talk that the Buddha, I'm reading the question, just to be clear. You mentioned early in your talk that the Buddha, as well as Greek philosophers, are not necessarily mentioned by name, but rather that their narratives are Islamized. Even so, would those in the Ikhwan al-Safa have understood figures such as the Buddha, Socrates, Plato as prophets, and thus Buddhists and Neoplatonists as people of the book on par with Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians? Do we have any knowledge of Buddhist, Jewish, and/or Christian attitudes towards this mystical dawa of the Ikhwan al-Safa?
Ikhwan al-Safa quotes a hadith in one of their epistles where supposedly the Prophet Muhammad says that had Aristotle lived in his time, he would have been a Muslim. And so they are using the voice of the Prophet Muhammad to give legitimacy to Aristotle, who was really revered throughout the medieval period by Muslim thinkers and to this day, for good reason, of course. They do really respect these figures, Aristotle, Plato, Plotinus, and others. Do they think of them as prophets? Not really. And I think Al-Farabi is really helpful in kind of thinking this through. He was a contemporary of Ikhwan al-Safa, and he had this theory about prophecy and what prophecy is. And basically the very simplified, oversimplified version of this theory is that the philosopher and the prophet have pure souls that allow their intellect to absorb the truth. Basically, for the philosopher, the soul is so pure, so purified, that the philosopher is able to transcend the physical realm, reach the intellect of the world in the hypostasis of Plotinus, and have access to all knowledge. But the difference for Al-Farabi is that once the soul of the philosopher comes back to this earthly realm, he can't really explain what he learned or what he knows to the people in a way that makes any sense. Whereas the prophet is able to comprehend the abstract ideas and the abstract truth, but then when the prophet's soul is in this physical world with other people, the prophet is able to use images and imagery and language that is accessible to the people so that they can understand what he is telling them. And so I think that Ikhwan al-Safa do see a distinction. They seem to align with Al-Farabi in his ideas about prophecy, but at the same time, they are very explicit that ultimately this is the same truth. Whatever language you're using to describe it is the same truth. Whether or not people understand it, whether or not it makes sense to people, it's the same content. And so the fact that they were able to understand and make sense of this material or this truth is what allows Ikhwan al-Safa to quote them all together, whether it's the Buddha or Plato or any of the prophets.
Fascinating. I don't know if our time might be up at this point. I've learned so much from you, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of your work about this. This is fascinating work, and will contribute a great deal to the scholarly work that we've had up until now. So Dr. Shatha Almutawa, I want to thank you for this amazing talk today.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your comments and for everything. It's wonderful to see you and hear from you today.
It's been my pleasure.